He creeps up behind his victim and slowly pulls out a long knife. Grabbing the man's head in one fast movement, he slashes his neck from ear to ear. As a fountain of blood pours from the wound, the killer takes out his cup. He's in need of sustenance. We didn't mention any names there, but what you just heard was pretty much how the man nicknamed the Skid Row Slasher killed his victims. As for the cup, he drained his victims and drank their blood. Cops sometimes found discarded cups next to the bodies. We'll get around to why he did that soon. First, some background. Not all you are familiar with the ins and outs of what goes down in the USA. In case you don't know, Skid Row is in an area of downtown Los Angeles that for decades has been a place where the homeless live, many of whom are addicted to drugs and alcohol. As far back as the 1930s, there were at times around 10,000 homeless folks that made Skid Row their home. It later became a containment zone, meaning the homeless were contained there, and certain organizations helped feed the desperate or put them up in a shelter. Today, there might be 5,000 homeless folks on Skid Row on any given day, but of course, people leave and return all the time. Over half the crimes in downtown LA happen on Skid Row. Murders are rare, but assaults are common. It's also the kind of place a killer might think they can get away with murder, seeing that it's almost treated like a municipal human trash can. That's why in the international bestseller Serial Killers for Beginners, it states in Chapter 4, Getting Away with It, if you want to stay out of prison, kill a poor person, better still, a homeless person. Getting away with murder is what the Skid Row Slasher had in mind when he went around almost decapitating people, sometimes sprinkling salt over his victims before imbibing a cup of their fresh blood. Many decades ago, the New York Times remarked on these strange rituals. The first victim was David Russell, a 64-year-old man who had a history of vagrancy. We can't tell you much about him other than the killer had cut his throat from ear to ear and stabbed him numerous times. He was dumped on the steps of the Los Angeles Public Library. On the very next day, a 67-year-old retiree named Benjamin Hornberg bumped into the slasher. His throat was also cut the entire way around, and he'd been stabbed all over his body. His was discovered in a hotel. Police suspected the murders were connected, given that both victims were murdered in a similar way, but for some reason, the killer just stopped. You'll soon know why. Late in 1974, the slasher got very busy. It was as if he was trying to break serial killing records. On December 1, 1974, he killed 46-year-old Charles Jackson. Jackson was a drifter known for his propensity to drink copious amounts of booze. What piqued the curiosity of the cops was this guy had been dumped in the exact same place as Russell had. That and the fact that the victim's throat had been cut. And he'd also been stabbed numerous times. As for why he was at the library, Jackson might have been a hobo, but he was also an avid reader. For some reason, he left a family in Louisiana only to end up on Skid Row, subsisting mostly on 60-cent bottles of Santa Fe Red Port and whatever scraps he could dig out of trash cans. The slasher was back, but finding a criminal moving in the jungle of Skid Row wasn't easy. Many of the residents there hadn't exactly had the best experiences with police, so interviewing folks posed a problem. After finding Jackson, cops also wondered if they had some kind of psycho on their hands. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill murder. After he'd been slain, his shoes had been taken off, his body then had been posed, meaning moved to a certain position. Moreover, salt had been sprinkled around the body and a cup of blood, mostly empty after being drank, lay nearby. While criminal profiling back then was just getting off the ground, the police consulted psychiatrists. They were told they were dealing with a sexual sadist who got off on manipulating the dead body, and of course the ritualistic blood drinking. Before investigators had much time to read up on vampirism, they found another body. Again, the victim had been posed, and it seemed his blood had been drunk. He was a 47-year-old Native Alaskan man named Moses Yakinak. His body was found in an alleyway just a week after Jackson had been found. Another transient made the discovery, shouting out loud, "Murder, murder, God help us." Yakinak was also homeless and addicted to booze. After saving a bunch of cash working in salmon canneries, he lost it all in one night playing cards. 54-year-old Arthur Dahlstedt came next, within just 3 days of the last murder. Like other victims, he'd been helped by the Christian Union Rescue Mission, although the words on the mission wall, "Jesus saves," were perhaps lost on him at the moment of his death. This guy had been in and out of foster homes his entire childhood, which led him toward the street of no return. On Skid Row, he actually let Jesus into his life again, so it came as shocking news to the mission when they'd heard he'd been found slashed to death next to the Montana Hotel on 5th Street. Now people were starting to get scared. The homeless were almost afraid to close their eyes as they settled down for the night under a bunch of rags and boxes. While there were often fights between folks, there wasn't actually much serious crime on Skid Row. Now the residents were being hunted by a maniac, and many of them couldn't put up much of a fight. This is how Rolling Stone put it at the time. The men of Skid Row are vulnerable. They carry no weapons. Their bodies are pitiful specimens. Tattered clothes cover undernourished bellies, flaccid muscles, lepidote skin, harsh scars from the batterings of the road. Robert Perez was one of them. He'd gone to Skid Row knowing he could probably find a spot to sleep without being moved on by the cops. He got the worst welcome imaginable, being introduced to the knife of the slasher just days after he arrived. This happened just over a week after Dahlstedt's body was found. Perez's bloodied body was discovered beside some Eugenia bushes, a spot just 50 feet from where Jackson had been discovered. Police couldn't say for a fact that all these murders had been the work of one person, but given the time frame and mode of killing as well as the rituals, there were certain as certain could be that there was one slasher. They knew a few things now too. The killer had to be strong. He'd cut them in with much ferocity and he'd obviously held them down. This was no half-starved waif of a man. He was likely large and domineering. On Skid Row, that discounted about 80% of the men. Cops believed they were probably looking for a reject from the hippie era, some kind of surfer dude who'd lost his marbles after one too many LSD trips. They were thinking 30-ish, well-built, long unkempt hair, probably strung out on speed. While they were in a minority on Skid Row, these types did exist there. Everyone was now tense. The homeless moved around with hawkish eyes, wondering if this guy or that guy might be the killer. They told exaggerated stories about how he first took a victim's manhood and then went to work on the rest of the body. If being homeless wasn't already bad enough, they were now starring in their very own slasher movie. They still avoided the police like the plague. Their interactions in the past had often meant jail, and jail meant sobriety, and sobriety meant hellish delirium tremens. Here's how one Skid Row resident put it. One time I seen some goings-on between this fellow and a girl in an alley, and the police knew I seen it. So they asked me to rat on this other fellow, but I wouldn't, and they took me off to jail for being a vagrant. They just hoped the killer would somehow stop. He didn't. A couple weeks later, he murdered 58-year-old Kasimir Strawinski. This man was riding precariously on the sharp edge of life. He was homeless and he was dying. He had cancer and his skin was covered with open sores. Since he knew he'd not be able to fight, he tried his hardest like many men to find a place to sleep indoors. When he couldn't stay at that Christian mission, he slept in a group with one guy standing guard while the other slept. Strawinski was determined not to have his throat cut. And then it seemed his fortune took a turn for the better. He received a check from the government which he used to get himself a room at the Pickwick Hotel, far from the streets where the killer lurked. On January 8th, a maid walked into his room. The place stank. On the bed was Mr. Strawinski. His throat had been slashed. Just over a week later, 46-year-old Robert Tex Shanahan was found. He certainly wasn't meek and he could have put up a fight. In another life, he'd been a paratrooper in the Korean War. He'd also worked on a Texas oil rig and done a number of other odd jobs before drifting into the thick mist of the American nightmare. But he had cash to spend after doing part-time work, and that he mostly spent at the popular Jake's Bar. One night when he was there, he felt terribly ill. Something wasn't right with his stomach. He told his friends, if this gets any worse, I'll have to miss the Super Bowl. That was going to be played on Sunday, and it was something Shanahan would never miss, never mind how sick he felt. But he didn't turn up at Jake's to watch the Pittsburgh Steelers lift the trophy. He wasn't at Jake's the night after or the night after that. His buddies just presumed he landed one of the rag-picking gigs out of town. Shanahan was then discovered in his room, already in a state of smelly decomposition, his mutilated body lying close to a wall where his Confederate flag hung. A bayonet from the war he had hung on that wall. Now it was sticking in Shanahan's body. Unlike the other victims, the killer had to stab Shanahan first before getting to work on his throat. This was almost certainly because Shanahan was a fighter. Just a few days later, 49-year-old Samuel Suarez was found in a similar state in a room at the Barclay Hotel. You'd think at this point there would have been a huge outcry in the media and in the public, but it was as if nothing had happened at all. If something like this had taken place in a nice neighborhood in Hollywood Heights, movies about it would already be in production. No one cared much for the stories about the mutilated hobos. 3 murdered white guys, 1 black guy, 2 Chicanos, all down on their luck, were about as newsworthy as a cat stuck in a tree in Orange County. Not one person went to the cops asking why they hadn't caught this guy yet. Not one solitary newspaper ratcheted up the hyperbole folks were used to when so-called respectable folks were murdered. Then something made people take notice. Just a week or so later, 45-year-old George Frias was found with his throat cut. He was a different kettle of fish, holding down a full-time job as a clerk at the LA Hilton Hotel. Frias had rubbed shoulders with well-off people. He walked in the hallowed hallways of the Hilton. Now there was a connection to normal folks. Police then put a sketch together of the man they suspected was behind all these bloody crimes. The picture was of a white male with long hair, about 30 years old, at least 6 feet tall, and damn strong. He was still that surfer dude. Psychological profilers told police that this man had a lot of daddy issues. He was a loner who'd been beaten in childhood, and it seemed he now wanted revenge on middle-aged men, symbols of his father. The profiler said he spent all of his time alone except for when he creeps out of his hole to commit these horrible crimes. They added that he was a sexually impotent coward, venting his own feeling of worthlessness on hapless derelicts and down-and-outers. It was also thought that he had the ability to make people feel at ease, and that's when he sprung with his sharpened blade. They were basically looking for a smooth-talking Patrick Swayze in the film Point Break, which came out years later. The cops couldn't have been further from the mark. 2 days after they found Fries, they discovered the body of 34-year-old Clyde Hayes. Now this killer was really making a fool of the cops. It was as if he wanted to be caught. He also knew he was certainly no washed-up surfer. The public was now also wagging its many tongues and talking about this ghastly killer. That was because Hayes was a white-collar worker whose comfortable life was a million miles from the lives of Skid Row's forsaken hobos. He was murdered in his house in Hollywood, but the mutilations and blood fetish pointed toward the Skid Row slasher. It was only then that police created a slasher task force. The lead detective told the media, "We're putting every available resource at our command to solve this thing." 3 days later, a man named William Graham thought he saw someone prowling outside his Hollywood home. He didn't think much of it until a man flew into his living room and struck him with a hatchet. Luckily, his friend came to the rescue. He fought with the hatchet man, and both of them ended up going through a window. But the perpetrator ran for it and later dropped a letter addressed to himself close to where the actor Burt Reynolds lived. On the name of the letter was Vaughn Greenwood. He was 31 years old. Greenwood was taken into custody for the assault and burglary, and guess what? There were no more murders while he was in jail. Police looked at this guy and wondered if he could be the killer. Thing was, he was black with short hair, a far cry from a white Hulk with messy long hair. This man had left school when he was just a kid. He'd certainly had problems with adults, running away from a foster home in Pennsylvania when he was in his early teens. From there, he drifted around the US doing farm work and ended up in California. As for the reason of that 10-year break we mentioned from the start, he robbed a 70-year-old guy named Mance Porter, slashing his throat and stabbing him. For that, Greenwood received a hefty prison sentence for aggravated battery. Okay, but what about the blood drinking? What about the body posing? What was wrong with this guy? We'll likely never know. He died in a California prison in 2020. You might have to do that if you want to understand why he did what he did, because little has been said about his motives. You can't metaphorically swing a cat on the internet without hitting the killer of the same era, Charles Manson. But the life and crimes of the Skid Row slasher had received about as much attention as Manson's choice of footwear. Some folks said Greenwood must have been part of a satanic cult, but they were likely pulling at too many straws. He might have made the choice to act like Count Dracula with table manners, but as crazy as that is, his crimes gather dust in the busy, neglected basement of serial killer lore. One of Tex's buddies who often drank with him at Jake's bar later talked to Rolling Stone. Tex might have been a nobody to the public, but he was a good friend to people that knew him. His buddy said, "I miss old Tex. I've been thinking about going to Texas and looking up his folks, tell him what hell of a guy he was. I guess I'd like to get away from here for a while." Even the cops didn't want to work on Skid Row. To the sensitive ones, it reminded them of everything that was wrong with the USA. One of the Skid Row slasher detectives once lamented, "That was probably the most detested assignment in the department. If you work Skid Row, you'll always remember that humanity has a depressing aspect to it." Now you need to watch I Went Homeless for 72 Hours, Real Challenge, or have a look at Hotel Where People Keep Dying.